In this video, I wanted to talk about how I found the machine and purchased it, disassembly, cleaning, stripping the paint off, painting, how I organize the parts prior to assembly. I actually bought this machine off of eBay. I called up Joe Guerrera in Watertown, Connecticut. We agreed on a price and agreed on some terms, and he shipped it out. It got to my place about a week later in Wisconsin, and here it is in my shop. You can see from this photograph my shop is not completed yet, so this machine just sat there for over a year while I worked around it to complete the shop inside. Joe told me that this lathe was in very good condition, and I trusted him, and he was right. It was a well-maintained old machine. And you can see from some of these photographs that all the parts were there, paint was worn off and clearly had some wear, but it was really well taken care of. When I began the disassembly, I just started tearing at it. I didn't really know much about the lathe, but I was determined to. But I took it apart, and most of the big parts I either sit right here in the shop waiting for cleaning and painting, or I put the bigger parts in boxes. This is a video I took of the lathe disassembled, mostly. Not every part was disassembled. But you can see here, here's the bell as it came off the machine. There's the back legs and a couple of aluminum doors and covers there. This is the bed of the lathe, by far the heaviest part. You can see I had to put it on wheels so I could move it around a little bit. Banjo, the reversing lever, the gear train, and some covers. Here are parts for the taper attachment. And this is the chip pan. There's the VFD, a couple of chucks that came with it. This is the partially disassembled quick change gearbox. I'm still wrestling with a taper pin here. On the floor you can see the rack, the lead screw and the crossfeed screw, sleeve bearing caps and the back gears with the eccentric lever. There's the spindle with the bull gear on it and the spindle cone pulley. There's the threading dial, the lead screw bracket, and the tailstock casting, which I had already started cleaning. Here's all the parts for the apron, more parts for the tailstock, and then this is the headstock, yet to be cleaned. It was pretty messy yet. There's a short leg there, and parts for the motor. I'd already been working on the motor a little bit. These are the electronic parts to control the motor, which I ultimately didn't use, and the underneath drive assembly that needed a lot of cleaning and clearly needed new bearings. You might notice the absence of the tailstock base and the saddle and the cross slide castings. I had already taken them to A&D Machine Rebuilding in Roberts to have them scraped. All of the smaller parts I wound up putting in bags and labeling the bags. That proved to be a very good idea. As I disassembled the machine, all the smaller parts, bearings and bushings and pins and screws and whatever else, I put in these small bags. You can see there's the tailstock, clutch lever, taper attachment, cross slide, gearbox, reversing lever, bolts for the bed, doors and covers, headstock, apron parts without the clutch parts, crossfeed screw, cam lock, left bearings and right bearings, oilers, motor tensioning and crank area, and there's the parts for the clutch.
Well, the machine is all together now, and the bags helped quite a bit because it may have been several months between the time I tore something apart and then I finally put it back together. So an old man like me, you forget how the thing went together. So it was very helpful to make sure the right parts, or at least for that component, were in the right bag. And here they are.
I think it turned out to be 25 bags of smaller parts. And like I said, this thing worked out really well. I'll save the bags and we'll use them for the next big project. Here are all the little parts that I replaced, except I threw all the old bearings out already. Cross feed and compound screw. There's a couple of rings here for the bearings. I didn't need them anymore. There's a bushing. A couple of pins that I replaced. Here's the oilers that I pulled out. I'll probably wind up throwing all these out.
This next little clip, I just wanted to describe the tools I use for cleaning and painting and disassembly.
Wire brushes were used a lot, and I have a little nibbler here that worked out good. It's kind of nice to have a reverse and forward as well. Go down to your local big box store and buy a bunch of abrasive stuff. For hand wheels and control levers and various parts, I used sandpaper reinforced with duct tape on the back. Not too fancy. I think I went from like 220 to 600 grit working on that parts. I also used a set of wood chisels that were sharp when I started. Now I'll have to resharpen them, but those are pretty handy for paint scraping and cleaning up flat surfaces. I also needed a good set of punches, but there's a difference. This is a taper punch, which is very strong. I use these to loosen up the taper pin, and then you knock out the loosened taper pin with a pin punch. When I cleaned the machine, I made sure that I chased all these threads with taps of the right size, getting things ready for reassembly. I did not go too fancy with the paint. I bought some black paint and some gray paint, and for the third color I just mixed them together. I bought some paint remover. This stuff worked really good. I used a gallon, plus I had to buy a little extra. For cleaning all the greasy parts, I just used mineral spirits. I think I went through a couple of gallons cleaning everything up. Plus I had some wire brushes. Make sure you stay safe with all this stuff. Wear gloves, eye protection. Trips to the emergency room aren't that much fun. The other tools I needed were all pretty standard. You guys probably have all these already. I had to buy a couple of things new, but not too many. Sockets, pliers, wrenches, etc. Then you'll also need a gear puller and a few heavier tools.
Now, when you're restoring a 40-year-old machine that hasn't been manufactured in quite a while, you got to have some good documentation, and I think that was very important for a good restoration.
I built myself a binder of documentation, and I bought this Lion renovation guide off eBay, and it was well worth the money. He does a great job in describing in detail disassembly and both assembly for all the various parts and pieces, including any tricks you might need for disassembly and installation of the felt wicks. You can see I have greasy fingerprints on almost every page. I also bought a packet of consumables from the same company, felt wicks mostly, and a couple other items. Another piece of documentation that was good was a South Bend's parts manual. This was very helpful in understanding all the parts and how they went together. These manuals have diagrams as well as listing of all the parts. It was pretty interesting. My machine is a 1978 vintage, and I found a parts manual for 1965 and another one for 1995, a 30-year span. And the parts of my machine and these two manuals were almost identical. It just goes to show you that South Bend made virtually the same machine for at least 3 decades, probably even more. And finally, my manual included the instructions for the VFD.
This video clip is going to show the physical removal of the paint and then just some interesting features about some of the bigger castings.
This shows the removal of the paint. The typical procedure here was 1 coat of paint remover, and then in about 20 minutes that first coat of paint just came right off, as you can see. And then I put a second coat of paint remover, which now took the primer coat off, which is a little tougher. And then after that I used a wire wheel to get whatever was left. Here you can see a little bit of body filler that was used prior to painting originally. Here's a quick clip of the bed, same procedure for the paint, but there was so much grease on it that I used the power washer several times in between the paint remover to get all the grease off.
This is the view of the bottom of the lathe bed. And you can see here the casting pattern. It's interesting, you can actually see the screws in the bottom of the pattern, or the effect of those screws. And there's a casting number here as well that was in the pattern. And you can also see the reinforcing X's here. After the casting was completed, they ground out. They probably have a lot of roughage here, and they ground them all off. Now the bottom of this casting was not painted. This was just all rust, which is fine. I don't think that matters. But now that I got the rust cleaned off, I'm just going to go ahead and paint this when I paint the rest of the casting for the bed. Here's the bell side of the lathe after it's fully stripped. And just interestingly, you can see here, these looks like the vents ports for the original casting. And you can also see they used an angle grinder to cut that vent off, smooth it out, and then the guy just kind of swung up to this one and then swung down and hit a defect here, and then done. Here's another defect. That body filler putty is still there. It held pretty good, so I'm just going to leave it. And then now I'm going to put some body putty on this in preparation for the primer coat. I suspect each of these bells, no matter what size, have these defects and body filler to cover them up. Well, that's it for this video. The rest of the videos in this series will be putting all these parts back together.